It's my honor tonight to introduce our leadoff speaker. It was 12 years ago that Chad Robichaux came to Broken Arrow for the first time. He always goes over to Triton Fight Center, does some training, some work there, and Reed Hastey was in that fight center that day, and Reed came out and listened to Chad's message on Sunday. But it was another 2 years before the real surrender started to happen. The seed was planted 12 years ago. 2 years after that, Reed went to Legacy, and that changed his life. Reed came home and got immediately plugged into the community here at the assembly, and it wasn't too long after that there was no doubt Reed was the one to start what was one of the first Mighty Oaks outposts in the nation, and certainly the first in all of Tulsa County in Oklahoma. And it has been a pace setter. It has set the standard for how God can work through veterans and first responders. It has now multiplied to many churches, and so many men, so many veterans and first responders have found God's help and hope through the outposts, and then to Legacy, or Legacy and then to the outposts. You can't lead something this effectively from the outside in. This kind of influence has got to come from a heart that is given totally to God. Reed is a man of God. Reed has a passion for God. Reed is a great and faithful husband. He is a great father. He is a great friend and a great leader. Would you help me give the best welcome to Reed Hastey?
Thanks, Pastor Ron. How's that, Mike? Good. Pastor Ron always gives the most generous welcomes. Honestly, it always makes me feel this big. He gives me a lot of credit for things that really I don't deserve. The only thing that I've done, maybe the only thing I should have credit for, is I was obedient and I prayed for leadership, and God delivered God-fearing men all around me, and they force-marched the gospel into their units, into their departments, into their community, and most importantly, they marched it right into their family. For those men, I'm grateful, and I'm grateful to be at home at the assembly. This is the church. This is a good community, and I love this city. One of my favorite things about this city is the name Broken Arrow, and that passes by us, right? Because we see it all the time. We hear it all the time. But I encounter a lot of veterans from all over the country, and they're very intrigued. They get a real kick out of the fact that Mighty Oaks has such a presence in a place called Broken Arrow, because in the military, that term is reserved for a nuclear event. Someone has misplaced or detonated a nuclear weapon. So they get a real kick out of that, right? So something bad has happened. And I thought it appropriate to share that tonight, because that's what I wanted to talk about, was when bad things happen, trials, tribulations. Just for the sake of this conversation, I'm going to use the word trauma as an umbrella term. And we all know trauma. Veterans, sometimes we like to think that we have the monopoly on trauma, but that's not true. Everybody's got an address, and that address is outside of the Garden of Eden, right? Where bad things happen. So like you, I'm not a stranger to trauma or bad things happening, but it wasn't always that way. When I was a kid, I had a really trauma-free childhood. I was blessed. And I grew up on a farm almost exactly 35 miles south of where we are right now. And man, it was a great childhood growing up on the farm. And when I was a kid, I actually didn't dream of growing up to be a soldier. I wanted to be a doctor. And I had a plan, and I was actually following through. My junior year of high school, I got my certified nursing assistant license at Green Country Votech. And between my junior and senior year, I went to Ruston, Louisiana. I got a job there in a nursing home, and I did an out-of-state transfer to Louisiana Tech, and I was knocking out my first semester of college early. It was a concurrent enrollment. So I completed that, and I came back to Oklahoma, finished to execute that last year of required high school, right, that senior year. And I was hanging out in a neighborhood that I shouldn't have been in, a place I shouldn't have been. You ever been in a place you shouldn't have been? Yeah, that's where we find our friend Trauma. That's where he lives. I was mistaken, a drug dealer mistaken me for someone else, and he hit me in the head with a baseball bat. An aluminum baseball bat caught me in the right ear, and the best way I can describe it, my ear exploded, and my body dropped to the ground. And what I remember is looking up at the sky, and as I came in and out of consciousness, my body felt like it was being sucked to the earth, like one of those rides at the fair, you know, the ones that spin around and suck you to the wall. And I couldn't get off this ride. And it felt like I was just cutting through the stars. And I remember, 17 years old trying to rationalize that. And I thought, I don't know what this is, but this is it. And my friends, they threw me in a car. They rushed me to the emergency room. They sewed my ear back together, CAT scan, and they wrapped me up in a head wrap. That's how I started my senior year of high school, was wrapped up with this fat head wrap. The reason I'm sharing that with you is because I want you to have full context of what happens next. My behavior started to change. It became erratic and unpredictable. I started doing strange things, like I would stay awake for several days at a time, and then I would sleep for a full 24 hours. And life for me just kind of became swells and wave tops, and there wasn't very much rest in between those two. And 2 months after getting back and having that head injury, just 2 months later, I think tragedy changed my trajectory, and somehow I ended up sitting in front of an Army recruiter. So I joined the Army. I joined the Army Corps of Engineers, finished that year of high school. A few weeks after I graduated, I was up and about to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri for U.S. Army basic training, and it wasn't traumatic at all. It was easy. I just Forrest Gumped right through it, man. No big deal, right? And so at the end of that, or toward the end of that first contract with the Army, something happened. Some people did something. September 11th, 2001. And as I say that, like so many of you, most of you, what do? You go back in time. Where was I at in that moment, right? But not everyone. As of this year, there's a group of adults. They're old enough they can walk into a liquor store legally, and they were not alive on September 11th. And that means we've made 21 trips around the sun. And I don't think we should let that be forgotten. I'm not turning this into a 911 memorial talk, but we need to tell young people where we were and what we saw. And I remember what I saw. I saw a woman stand at the edge of what was a window, and she looked back and down, and she made a decision that day. I don't think she planned on making this decision when she dropped her kids off. Do I burn alive, or do I jump to my death? And we responded. Some prayed. What do? We sent money. Some went down. They donated blood. I re-enlisted. And in 2004, I finally caught that ride into the Sunni Triangle. I was deployed with the 120th Engineer Combat Battalion Heavy, and when we arrived in Iraq, my section, we picked up these 2 armored D9 bulldozers, these huge machines. They were up-armored by the Israeli Defense Force and handed off, and we were tasked with securing this place called the Boneyard outside of the Mech compound of Fallujah. So we're out there clearing sectors of fire and destroying enemy rocket and mortar positions. And when we're not doing engineering tasks, we were in and out of Fallujah 3 times. Operation Vigilant Resolve, Operation Phantom Fury, also known as the First and Second Battle of Fallujah. And we went back in a 3rd time for something called Spartacus Battalion, which was a security team that provided overwatch for the 2005 elections. You may remember the blue thumbs. That was a very iconic moment in history. So we weren't doing engineering jobs or security or QRF. We were running a lot of convoy operations. We would exit this place called Takatam Air Base, and we were on this very large body of water called Lake Habanaya, MSR Fiesta, the Pancake Village, Ramadi. Man, we would do this jump over at a place called the Truck Stop, and the Cloverleaf in Fallujah, and we would roll into Baghdad, catch a couple hours sleep in a transient tent, up and about, rinse and repeat. I was not spiritually prepared for the atmosphere there. The rules of engagement downrange were confusing, and the missions were compartmentalized and unclear. As for the overall conditions, I was unable to leave Fallujah an honest 5-star Google review, and I'll leave it at that. So it wasn't that great. But that year, man, it was a long tour. It honestly was, and there's a lot of things that I could share. I'm going to pick one thing that kept me up at night, and I'm sharing this because I think everybody has one thing that affects their sleep hygiene. But I was given orders. We had a guy that was a suicide attempt. He was okay, but I had to escort him out of Iraq and get him into Germany. I had to drop this guy off of a mental institute, cut orders, and get back downrange with my team. And this journey took us through a place called Balad Air Base, and he and I stepped off of a helicopter, and we walked into this hospital tent, and what we were met with was several Iraqi police officers who were laid out on stretchers and litters. They were wrapped up. What was explained to us was they were all waiting to get paid, and they got hit by an RPG. This didn't shake me, but what did was the 3-year-old little girl that got caught up in that mix. And this little girl, half of her face was burnt, and she cried unceasingly for days for her mother. And we were in this hospital tent we were there for 4 days. There was no way to get away from this because my orders were to stay within arm's reach of my package. So we finally caught a C-5 out and into Germany. And I just took that with everything else, man. I stuffed it down in my ruck. We got to move on. But that was one of those times, it felt like somebody hit a switch in the back of my head, and what that did was just shut off emotions. But man, you hit that switch too many times, and I'm convinced that it breaks. That's how I finished that deployment. As challenging as it was, it didn't compare to returning home. The thing about those desert deployments, you come home, you turn over your boots, and you shake, and the sand never stops coming out. I finished my contract, but I limped to the finish line while I was downrange. Just a freak accident. I blew L5-S1 in my spine. So I was dealing with a lot of chronic pain, and I also had a lot of internal issues. Thanks to the anthrax vaccination, that's a 5-shot cycle. The Army pulled both my brother and I off of that shot. We both had adverse reactions on the 3rd shot, and we both ended up in separate emergency rooms. So we actually deployed not fully inoculated, but they're still monitoring my labs. So I'm not a stranger to the hospital, but I started having panic attacks, and this was something new. This wasn't something I'd experienced before. I actually thought I was having seizures, like maybe I took a nap in some depleted uranium. I don't know. I know that sounds silly, but when we came off of that rotation in 2005, that initialism, PTSD, that was not part of the mainstream conversation. It wasn't part of a debriefing, so I went to the doc and I got checked out, and I was diagnosed with bipolarism, agoraphobia, anxiety disorder, and of course, post-traumatic stress disorder, and later traumatic brain injury. I did get some good help. I was fortunate. I've spent over 47 hours in oxygen decompression chambers at Oklahoma State University. I think it helped. But what didn't help was the pharmaceutical cocktail. So I took this regimen and I tried to return to the civilian world. I lost my first job because I was unable to build effective relationships with customers or coworkers. So I got a job that didn't require me to build relationships. Unfortunately, I lost that job because I missed too much work. The reason I missed so much work, my ex-wife, she, on multiple occasions, she would drive me to the Jack C. Montgomery VA Hospital in Muskogee, and she would walk me into the emergency room and hand me off to the triage nurse and say, I brought him back. You got to do something with him before he kills himself or he hurts somebody in our family. And they take me right up to the 5th floor, and that's where they give you a tune-up. And a tune-up is just where they keep you for a week or so, and they adjust your medications. So this part of the story, like, we can stop digging and plant our shovel. This is a low point. This is definitely my low point in the story. And, I think everybody's got a low point. You may be in that low point right now. Somebody in here may be in that low point. Man, you just need to hang tight. So the reason I say this was my low point, man, it seemed like what was a flash. I went from being a non-commissioned officer serving downrange in the theater of combat. We were in the big show. The whole world was watching what we were doing there. I wasn't just responsible for me, I was responsible for others. And now I'm locked up and I'm not allowed to have bootlaces. I think the doctors there, I believe, with the best intentions they had, they would send me back out into the world and they would hope that everything would be okay and I wouldn't be back. Things were never okay. I thought going back to school might be the answer. So I did what all combat veterans do. I went down and enrolled in the local community college. And I might be 26 at this time, and I'm still pretty fresh off of that deployment. They tried to enroll me in a class there's a freshman level class called Leadership Development with a bunch of 18-year-olds. And it did not work out. It didn't work out. I was going to school in this program. I was thankful while I had it. It was called vocational rehabilitation, but I was pulled out of that program. I got an official letter from the government. It says, you are not a feasible candidate for rehabilitation. In other words, that's just a way of saying you're too mentally and physically broke for us to invest any more money into. So that became my new official identity, too broken. And from that, and with that identity, things spiraled out of control. Divorce, I lost custody of my kid. My house went into foreclosure, and I ended up back on the family farm. Now, up to this point, I get it, this is like the worst country and western song ever written, is what you're experiencing. But man, when we look in the rearview mirror, we can see clearly God's boundaries, and the curbs that he's allowed, right? So that we can be guided. And he guided me, and I crossed paths with a couple of very important people. One of them was Pete Wilhelm. He owns Triton Fight Center. And my encounter with him, I just sort of meandered into his gym. I don't even know what I was looking for or how I ended up in front of him, but I'll never forget this encounter. Basically what he said to me was, hey, I can tell you're in the military. If you want to train here, I'll give you a special rate. Here's the terms, you can take it or you can get lost. And I knew right away that was exactly what I needed to hear at exactly the right moment. That was the attitude and that was the environment that I needed. Shortly after that, a couple of weeks, maybe it was a month, I was set up by a friend, set me up on a blind date with a young brunette school teacher. And when I picked her up, she made it clear she was not excited. It's like she could have been grading papers, right? But by the end of the night, I'd won her over, and she actually agreed to a second date. And she said something to the effect of, yeah, I'll go out with you again. Here's the terms. You can take it or you can get lost. And I don't believe in that word coincidence. And through my wife, Amber, through her encouragement, and through Pete and through Pete's connections, I met Chad Robichaud. So when I met Chad, he invited me out to California to this ranch he'd built for veterans. And I'm like, no, thanks, man. I know it's faith-based. I'm an agnostic. So I'm keeping him at arm's distance. And I would encounter him through the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu world several times over the next few years. And he invited me down to Texas. But I was just trying to keep distance from him, really, until finally he asked me to come out. He told me that he needed someone to help him teach Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to veterans. So I agreed. And I got out to California, and the first thing I learned was that was a lie. So I get it. I know you're here to eat barbecue and listen to Chad later. Just don't trust anything that he says. So no, you can trust him. If he was here, I don't think he's in here. I don't know if I've ever actually thanked him for being persistent and telling me that lie. I'm so glad that he did, and he didn't have to do that. So thanks, Chad, if you see this later. But when we got out there, these guys, these warriors out there, these combat veterans, they presented the Bible to me. They presented the gospel in a way that I'd never experienced it before. They took this thing And they presented the Bible like it was a field manual, like a soldier's handbook. And this spoke to me. God spoke through this. I gave my life to Christ and I was baptized there. We spent a lot of nights there talking, staying up, sitting around fires. We talk about a lot of different things. Some of what we talk about is trauma. And of course, we also talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. And there's this definition that we use there for post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is a normal response to an abnormal situation. A normal response to an abnormal situation. Where do we get that definition? Comes from a man named Dr. Viktor Frankl. Dr. Frankl is a neuropsychologist, psychoanalyst. He is highly educated, obviously, and lots of clinical experience. So he's qualified to give that definition, but the reason Warriors trust what he has to say about it is he's a Holocaust survivor. He actually got out of Auschwitz alive. But if the good doctor was here in front of me, I would have a question for him. I'd ask, Doc, if the situation is abnormal, but my response is normal, then why has society labeled me as disordered? So if you're here, if you have that label or you have that diagnosis, what I would encourage you to do is I would ask you to drop that word disorder right out of your mental lexicon. You don't need that in your vocabulary. I'll own a lot of things. But I'm not out of order. So with that, if you're somebody and, hey, I don't want this to get lost, and this isn't a military talk, this thing, trauma or post-trauma stress, like what I'm known to deal with, man, this can affect everybody. We're all going to go through trauma. We're all going to land right a bang at some point. So I don't want to lose you on this. And what I really want to talk about is the stress that comes after trauma or after trials. Now, in the veterans community, what we see often, this stress can manifest itself in many ways. Two primary ways that we see at Mighty Oaks: anger and anxiety. So anger and anxiety, and what's interesting is those are connected. Often if I'm discipling to a guy, if I'm working with a guy and his surface level issue is anger, I'll often ask, you happen to be on anxiety medication? Often they are. And the reason they're connected, and I didn't figure this out on my own, I had a mentor. He told me to read this book, this workbook called Quieting a Noisy Soul by Pastor Jim Berg. And the way that Pastor Berg breaks anger and anxiety down, they are both a crisis in your faith. So when you're anxious, what you're saying is, I don't know if God's going to take care of this. And when you're angry, and let me clarify something, I'm talking about sinful anger. I'm not talking about righteous indignation. I know that Jesus kicked over tables. I haven't forgotten that. It's one of my favorite stories. So I was talking to my friend Billy, this was just a few days ago, and he said something profound I hadn't heard. He said, Reed, Jesus only kicked over tables that were his to kick over. And that's just that was good for me to humble myself and to hear that. But it was also a reminder that we need to braid our whips. But back to anger, I'm talking about that sinful anger that all men, we find ourselves in. What we're saying when we're there is, I'm mad because God is not taking care of this. I'm either anxious because I don't know if he is, or I'm angry because he isn't. The important thing to understand about both of those is from those points, the enemy will push you, he'll marginalize you, he'll get you into a checkpoint. If you've heard Chad talk before, he talks about being on the X. That's that checkpoint where the enemy pushes you. It's an ambush point. He wants you to be there. So from there, we end up in a place called despair. And when the last bit of light closes in that place of despair, that's a place called hopelessness. And in that spot, man, that's where broken arrow events happen. That's where guys decide to pull the lever. Suicidal ideation. And the enemy, he will glue us there. He'll get you trapped there. There's this thing, I like to call it the why loop. Not the letter Y, but the question why. Why did this happen to me? Why did God allow this to happen to me? And the reason it's a loop is because if you look out there into the world, man, you'll find a lot of opinions, but you will not find a solid foundation. You will not find an objective jump-off point for that why loop. There is not a pharmaceutical. There is not a pill. There is no behavioral modification I can share with you to get out of that. But there is a place that we can go. There's a solution. Romans 10:17 says, remember, we're talking about a crisis in faith, right? Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God, right? So that's where we'll go. We're going to talk about the word of God. I know you've seen this demonstration before, but I like it, so I'm going to do it again. You rub those two pages together, that's Genesis 1 and 2. Man, that's peace. That's inside the garden. That's before we got the eviction notice. The rest of it, you know what we can find here? Rape, murder, genocide, suicide, human sacrifice, mutilation, trauma, tribulations, war, all of those things. We've been blessed with this field manual to negotiate and to navigate through trauma. Right. It's not just it's also a weapon. So in Ephesians 6, it's described as a sword of the Spirit. And the significance of that, if we go back, if we boil that down or we research back that word sword, it's cherub or rudis. What's the significance? And that's a very specific 18-inch blade. It's not this huge thing we beat people over the head with. It's a precision weapon. It's designed to slip in between the armor plates of your enemy. Every word in here is placed with exactitude. So we can go here to the weapon, to the field manual. And here's what I know about field manuals. I was able to go to the Primary Leadership Development course at the NCO Academy, Camp Shelby, Mississippi. And this was many years ago. But the thing I remember most about that experience, the first week was nothing but classroom. And they stacked in front of us this overwhelming pile of books, binders, Army regulations, and of course, field manuals. And I remember being overwhelmed and thinking, how are we going to memorize and learn all this information? I was relieved when I learned that the Army was not looking for know-it-all soldiers. What they wanted was good leaders who would go into the field manuals and get the answer and then apply them. So that's what we want to do to get off of that Y loop and jump off of there. So I'll take you there. If you're in the Y loop, if you're stuck in that loop asking that, I got a grid coordinate for you. It's James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, which says, my brothers, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. Various trials. That means all kinds. So it applies to everything we got in the room. Count it all joy when we fall into various trials. Let the testing of your faith produce patience, and let patience have its perfect work so you are complete and lacking in nothing. Our faith is going to be tested, and we are being built up for something bigger. What is it? Man, I'm not sure. But I know there's a story, Mark 4 in the Bible. You know it. Storm on the Sea of Galilee. And what happened was the wind came up, and the waves started hitting the boat, and they started taking on water. And the men there, the disciples, they panicked. They became anxious. And they woke Jesus up, who was asleep on his pillow. He had a couple of things to say. Peace, you be still. And you, where is your faith? Who is this man that even the winds and the sea obey him? Pastor Ron, that's that authority that you were preaching about last Sunday. I think I know what happened out there, because this happens to me. Tell me if this sounds familiar. You navigate into a storm, man, you're handling it okay. As soon as you get wet, as soon as the water hits you, that cold sea water, we let Proverbs 8:29 just escape the boat. It says, he set the limits of the sea, and the waters will not transgress his command. It's a good lesson for where we need to stay hyper-focused, which is on Jesus. I wonder, though, it doesn't say this in the Bible, but I've often wondered if anybody looked back at the boat and thought, man, that wasn't so bad. If we read into Mark 5, we know that they made it to the beach, right? And I bet the sand felt good on their feet. But what did they encounter next? We read into Mark 5, my name is Legion, for we are many. I've incorrectly assumed, and I've even shared, I thought that was 1,000 demons. But if we look back into Roman antiquity, into Roman military history, a Roman legion was 6,826 soldiers. That's 6,100 foot soldiers, an additional 726 horsemen. Don't worry, the math adds up. The point is, that's a lot of demons, man. That's a lot of demons. And I don't know about you, but I like my demons to show up one at a time, man. Sorry, Mr. Demon, you got to take a number, sit in the waiting room, because I'm dealing with your friend right now. I want to talk about this thing. Well, let's look at this from another. We know from that story, we're being built up for something. So we can get off of the why loop, and we can drop that question, and we ask a more important question: what? What does God want us to do with these experiences? And the good thing is, man, we don't need to do a self-inventory, and we don't need to look at the stars. We can go right to the manual. And it's in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 3 and 4. Thanks, Matt. Blessed be the God and the Father. Blessed be the God and the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our tribulations, that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. It says 5 times comfort in just those few verses. In the military, that's what we call a blinking neon arrow. We need to go this way, and we need to become comforters. Job 29:25, I dwelt as a king in the army, as one who comforts mourners. If you think about the time that was written, that is such an interesting and specific and peculiar description of a high military commander, a comforter. But that's what we're called to be. So that's how we jump from why to what. Like I said, we all deal with trauma. We all came out of this thing recently, and we're still feeling the aftershocks of this global pandemic, right? And we all dealt with it differently. Those of you, my friends that are extroverts, man, you guys were hurting, right? Man. I remember, right, Pastor Ron? Oh, my. I remember my first trip out. I went out my front door the same way that all of you did. I went to the grocery store, my favorite grocery store right over there on Memorial, the place they sell the healthy cookies and you can eat them and you don't feel bad about yourself. I got up there to the front door, and there was a bouncer. And I'm pretty sure... What I remember is he was not alive on September 11, 2001. That's what I remember about him. But his job was to make sure that no more than 50 people were in the grocery store. So it was finally my turn, and there was 49 other shoppers and I, and we were walking around, and we were following these arrows. And I made sure that we didn't come face to face with each other. Everybody's wearing a mask, of course. Nobody spoke to me. Nobody made eye contact. I got up to the front and paid the lady on the other side of the plexiglass. She barely acknowledges my existence. And I got back out to my truck, and I thought, man, I hope we never go back to normal. This has been the best trip to the grocery store I've ever had, man. So those experiences, there's other experiences I don't handle as well, right? But it depends on, well, let me say this, man. There was a lot of people that was spun up. There was a lot of people that were overwhelmed with anxiety, right? This house was a rock. But everybody was concerned. Where did it come from, and how do we respond? Where did it come from? Were people eating bats, or did it come from an evil scientific lab? I'm like, is there a door number 3? Because both of these options are nightmares. Where did it come from? And how do we respond? And I wish somebody in charge would read 2 Chronicles 7:13, because it tells us, when I shut up heaven and there is no rain, or command the locusts to devour the land, or send pestilence among my people, where did it come from? How do we respond? If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and I will heal their land. That's the rock we stand on. So that's how we move from why to what. I want to talk about this thing called the PTSD bell curve, or the resiliency bell curve. And this is secular. This is from out in the world. You can find truth in the world. You just have to keep in mind they are always 2,000 or 3,000 years late to the crime scene. So this bell curve, I put it up. This helps me to demonstrate or walk through this point. Trauma that we all experience, and we all handle it differently. Some of us, after we go through a traumatic experience, we fall on the post-traumatic stress side, meaning our relationships suffer, our quality of life decreases, anger, anxiety, depression. However, there are some people who go through traumatic events and they experience something called post-traumatic growth. Their life actually improves. They get a new lease on life. Their view of things changes. Their relationships get better. They go out in the world and they become comforters. If there's anything that I hope you'll remember, it's that wherever you fall right now after an event, through Christ, you have the ability to go on the other side of the bell curve. You're not stuck wherever you are. I got a friend here named Greg, and my first encounter with Greg, well, he wouldn't come to church. I'd say he was gripped with anxiety, and he certainly wouldn't come to our outpost meetings, which if you're a veteran or first responder, Monday nights at 7 o'clock, or Saturdays at 4:30 over at the Rose District. Come in and inventory what we're doing. But he wouldn't come to that meeting, so I agreed to meet him at Brahms Ice Cream and Dairy in Broken Arrow over here. So I sat down with Greg, and he told me a story about being in the wrong place in the wrong time and blunt force trauma to the head and losing his identity and purpose that sounded remarkably familiar. And we were able to connect, and God worked through his heart and gave him courage, and he finally came to the meeting. That was a few years ago. Greg is now in the leadership pipeline at Mighty Oaks, and he has taken over that outpost. He's now the leader. He facilitates. He does the lessons. Greg, where are you? Stand up. Greg. I'm up, they see me, I'm down. That's a little Army joke. So one more thing I want to share with you from the world. I try not to share an opinion, but I'm going to share one opinion with you. Matt, if you'll put up the quote for me, please. So every veteran that comes through Mighty Oaks is exposed to this. I'm going to read it to you. I would just say there is one misperception of our veterans, and that is that they are somehow damaged goods. I don't buy it. If we tell our veterans enough that this is what is wrong with them, they may actually start believing it. While victimhood in America is exalted, I don't think our veterans should join those ranks. There is also something called post-traumatic growth, where you come out of a situation like that and you actually feel kinder toward your fellow man and fellow woman. There is no room for our military people, including our veterans, to see themselves as victims, even if so many of our countrymen are prone to relish that role. No. That's General James Mattis, the Mad Dog. No disrespect to the Mad Dog, but I'm going to reread the last sentence, and I'm just going to put my own little tweak on this. I don't think he would mind. There is no room for Christian men to see themselves as victims, even if so many of our countrymen are prone to relish in that role. We don't fall into that. We are not of this world. We're stuck on this rock for now. I'm waiting on the rapture vacuum. But this isn't the rock that I lean on. I might be glued here for now, but I don't lean on that rock. How do we do it? Like, what's an example? So the manual, the field manual, it gives us a 3,000-year-old case study. I'm going to take you there. It's in Psalms, and it starts in chapter 6, and it goes through 10. This is written by David, of course, a king who dwelt in the army, and this guy's qualified. He knew a lot of trauma. And this is what he says. He said, I am weary with my groaning. All night I make my bed swim. I drench my couch with my tears. My eyes waste away because of grief. It grows old because of all my enemies. Has anybody ever had a night like that? Here's what I've learned about field manuals. They present a problem and then solution. Depart from me, all you workers of iniquity, for the Lord has heard the voice of my weeping. The Lord has heard my supplications. The Lord will receive my prayer. Let all my enemies be ashamed and greatly troubled. Let them turn back and be ashamed suddenly. He called on the Lord. That was the solution. If you're here, if you deal with anxiety, I'm going to jump ahead 1,000 years in this book. 2 Timothy 1:7. And it says, for God has not given you a spirit of fear, but one of power and of love and a sound mind. Spirit of fear, that's anxiety. We need to remember this. This becomes like an immediate action drill. And read, I'm not good at memorizing Bible verses. Like we remember things in threes, right? Stop, drop, tap, rack. You can't do that everywhere. You can do it in Broken Arrow. So we need to remember that. We need to spit that out. Power, love, sound mind. This is Oklahoma, so just push those two words together. Power, love, sound mind. And I'm not just telling you this. When I come up here on stage, man, I'm extremely nervous, and I said that before I came up here. And so far, well, nothing's caught on fire or anything, so we're surviving this anxiety thing. One more thing on Paul. Look, I'll share something personal. I'm often drawn into this part of the Bible because Paul wrote about, he often referenced soldiers and farmers and athletes, and I've been blessed. I've got to live all three of those chapters at one point or another. But if I go one more page in my Bible, like how do we do this? 2 Corinthians 2, verse 3. It says, endure hardness as a good soldier for Jesus Christ. I just don't feel like that's the right music. Endure hardness as a good soldier for Jesus Christ. We're called to endure. So, here's a question I'll leave you with. Are we living up to that standard? Are we as Christian men living up to that standard? And here's a challenge I'll leave you with. Whatever you've been through, man, it may seem insignificant to you, but you are now the subject matter expert, the designated SME for that specific trauma. So we need to go out and find somebody to comfort. The Bible says that anxiety in the heart of man causes depression, but a good word can make it glad. Something as small as a phone call can block hell and cast a shadow for a guy to catch his breath in. So let's go over the other side of the bell curve and find somebody to help. Broken Arrow, God bless you. I love you guys. Pastor Ron, end of speech.